right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Tia Oso. I'm a principal with Zio, and we are here for another episode of Infinite Patterns, a Kaleidoscope podcast, exploring the infinite perspectives shaping and transforming the field of journalism. This podcast is created in partnership with the Borealis Philanthropy Racial Equity and Journalism Fund. RED seeks to strengthen a future where communities of color are powerful. And they do this by nourishing independent media and media led by BIPOC communities. I'm joined here today with two REG grantees, and we're going to be discussing the topic of community voices, amplifying marginalized perspectives in journalism. So I'm joined today by Uyoisa and Giannina, and I ask you both to introduce yourselves, introduce the work that you do, and why you thought that this would be the topic that you wanted to discuss on the Infinite Possibilities podcast today.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Tia, for having me today. I am Giannina Ong. I am Editor-in-Chief of Mochi Magazine. It is the longest running digital publication by Asian American women for our community. And I wanted to talk about amplifying our voices, just because I think too often Asian American women fall into this stereotype of being, very subservient, very quiet, that they don't have voices, and then they're valued for that, rather than understanding, the unique stories and perspectives that Asian American women bring to the table, especially in this country and our history. Especially with Asian Americans having a history that is often untold and buried. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Giannina. Really important perspective to hear. Uyiosa?
Hey, y'all. I'm Uyiosa Elegon. I am the marketing director and development director over at Shift Press, even though I do a bunch of different things, as most folks at nonprofit newsrooms. Shift Press is a youth media organization, actually Houston's only youth media organization that's dedicated to power. So we're both a publisher and an education space. We provide the news, and we also teach people how to do it and pay them all at the same time while doing both of those things. I really am excited to be a part of this conversation because myself and other folks who founded Shift Press are all organizers. We all have our own different paths, separately and together, before founding Shift Press. And the one thing that you can say that we all very much deeply agreed on and understood from the very beginning is that the news ecosystem is particularly an adult news ecosystem. So you'll hear me referring to other news organizations as adult news organizations very often in this call, most likely, just because we really want to make that very clear. But super excited to share all the things that we know from our end, and things that we don't know, and things that we're still figuring out. Super excited to be on this call with y'all.
Amazing. Yeah, I'm very excited to be in conversation with both of you. And definitely, amplifying the perspectives and stories of Asian women, amplifying the stories and perspectives of youth in Houston, Texas. Definitely voices and perspectives that we don't get to hear a lot about. And so really relevant to the conversation today. And, when we're talking about amplifying community voices and marginalized perspectives in journalism, the things that came to my mind first were just about the industry of media as a whole, and how it's going through such rapid shifts, especially around things like tech, especially around financing and corporate governance. We see a lot of rapid changes happening, and in a lot of ways, the control of the dominant media, or as you call it, the adult media, is being consolidated into fewer and fewer hands, and those hands, those corporate entities, and even in local newsrooms, right, being really led and controlled by largely white men and their perspectives about what's important, what's news, what's newsworthy, right, the ways that people should be informed, which perspectives should be shaping, the media that is being disseminated to our communities. And in a lot of ways, we are seeing the editing and editorial perspective being shaped by from these white male perspectives, as well as to even how audiences should be thinking about or receiving this information that they're getting. And what we know, with the Racial Equity in Journalism Fund, and from both of your perspectives of the organizations that you're representing, we know how important it is to have independent voices, how important it is that we have media organizations that are coming from the perspective of the communities that you're serving. And so I'm really excited to both hear your voices about your perspective on these different issues that are facing your media organizations, as well as the communities that you're looking to serve and represent. And so I think my opening question is, what are the biggest challenges that your organization may be facing when it comes to both serving your audience and also the challenges that you're facing, like in this dominant, in the current media landscape? And either of you can begin it. We can just flow from there.
I think it's a very complex answer, right? I think one challenge that I have with our audience of Asian Americans is that many Asian Americans, especially, new immigrants and then first gen, don't really understand why the term Asian American exists. They associate it with the model minority myth, that, it's a very oppressive stereotype in that, we are expected to be exceptional and, aligned with white society. But at the same time, we can't make any mistakes and we can't be less than. But they don't, I think, especially the folks who have not had generations here in the United States, they don't understand that Asian American is a relatively new term that came about in the 60s in order to align, our very different cultures and identities, right? When we're talking about Asian, we're talking about, a whole country of, so many cultures and identities, right? But we came together to align as a group to form, to create power amongst ourselves and in line and in solidarity with, the Black youth movements, the Latinx youth movements, the Indigenous youth movements of the time, right? So I think it's funny because when I think that there's a report from Pew saying that, majority of people who are Asian in America don't identify as Asian American. And they want to identify by their specific ethnicity. And of course, we should embrace, their unique identities. But I think that there's a certain power that we are forgetting that we have when we claim the identity Asian American. And that power, lends our ability to work alongside our brothers and sisters of color, right? So I think that for me, what is really important is not that we talk about our stories and cover topics important to our community, only for Asian Americans and for Asian power, but so that we understand where we fit into the grander scheme of, working towards liberation and autonomy and the rights that we all deserve as people of color who are, the global majority. Yeah.
I think two things come to mind on this end, or at least maybe three. I think first that popped up is, youth storytelling, whether that is online, whether that's through their social media, whether that's through their own publications, whether that's at the lunch table, the content and the subject within those stories aren't considered worthy to distribute because they're simply youth, right? And they tend to only be distributed on the terms of being conferred by an adult, right? Obviously, we see that on the schooling level when it comes to teachers and administrators. But even outside of that, looking at youth media organizations, things aren't necessarily pooled into the kind of main dialogue unless it really, really, really bothers adults. Let's think about Columbia, for example. Everyone's saying, oh, these students should get Pulitzers for their groundbreaking reporting right now. But the truth is they were always Pulitzer worthy. I'm not saying I really vibe with Pulitzers in general. My point is that what is now it's important to you. Now their reporting is of a certain stature because they're reporting on a subject matter that's important to you and that's bothering you. And then I think the second one, other than money, because I think that Giannina hasn't brought it up, but I mean, money's always a problem. But other than money, I think there's a certain starvation that I've noticed amongst our writers and different organizers across the city, in that everyone really, really, really loves our storytelling. And that's very lovely to see. But there are two things that I also see happening. One is that we don't even think that we're hitting what's even possible, right? It's like they are like fiending for more, even though it's like, dang, that must mean you really didn't have anything for so long. But also the starvation also makes us a little vulnerable, because I've noticed other adult media organizations that I also have been building for a while have started to actually, once they see we're on the scene, they rush over to try to report, right? And the problem is that some people then laud that as wins, but the truth of the matter is they have their different agenda and they also report in a different way. And at the end of the day, if they give them more views or more money, that doesn't help the youth media infrastructure that we're trying to build across the city. So those are two things that come to mind immediately.
Thank you both for those powerful shares. And so you brought up a couple of different topics, both of you did, about power. What is the power of your building your media outlet, and from the perspective of the work that you do, and not just the work that you do, from the perspective of the communities that you're serving, what does that power building look like?
This is something we talk about every single day at Shift Press, because we talk about power. So it's a part of almost every single conversation and every pitch process. So I think there's two parts. There's the infrastructure, and then there's the subject matter, like the actual editorial process. I'm going to focus a lot on the infrastructure just because everyone talks about narrative power. And I'm like, I want to really push it into the infrastructure level of mention that when it comes to the purpose of media or news organizations, I've always understood it historically to be able to give people the information that helps them be able to take grassroots action. From my understanding of when that old white man was concocting the idea of news deserts, he was saying there weren't enough information centers that did that. Not that there weren't information centers, which is what the conversation has reduced to, but there are not enough information centers that help people take grassroots action. Now, when it comes to us, I think the truth is that young people across every epoch have been at the forefront of almost every major movement that one could probably mention. Almost every movement has been intergenerational, truth. But as far as a lot of the people who hold the mic, a lot of people who push the bounds of what's imaginable, a lot of the people who take a lot of the first risk in regards to movements, it's normally children, and if not young adults. So when it comes to pushing everyone's lives forward, it has come down to how able are young people able to form and disseminate their own stories. That's what it's come down to. Mind you, I love elders. I want to put that out there because people see me rocking hard for the young people, but it's I love elders, and there's an important wisdom with them. But the point is we are really focused on not being the only youth media organization in Houston, right? Thinking about how can we uplift these schooling news organizations to be ones that are not just based on schooling, but those are community news organizations. That's the truth of the matter. And then on the editorial side, always writing in a different way. I think that we have been talking about ways of writing the news even differently recently. I know I'm probably going to get in trouble because we haven't executed this, but we've been thinking about how, because we align ourselves with movement journalism so very strongly, we wanted to see how we could have news reports also include at the very bottom some commentary from those same authors about their own feelings and biases while they were reporting on this, right? So, for example, if you want to report on the recent jailing of two protesters at the University of Houston, You can have that news piece that gives people the facts, gives it straight up what's going on. But at the end of it, like, feel free to talk about how, and this is me, right? Feel free to talk about how the police really were, dogging on you and asking for your press identification, all these different things, right? You should feel free to do that. And I think that it enriches the storytelling and makes a lot of people at these established news organizations like the New York Times and other people mad because we're not being objective. And we think that's a good thing. So those are some things that we think about as like how we take the power back, because there's no way that we can just do the storytelling and not talk about these other things as reporters or storytellers, because that doesn't change our lives for the betterment of the storytelling. So long-winded, but I would love to hear from Giannina, because that I'm really curious from your.
I think for us, there's a more philosophical approach to this, in that I love our elders too, I will say. But, growing up, one thing I had heard from them is, children, and I think this speaks to what you're saying, Uyoisa, about, children and youth, but they had said, quote unquote, children have ears, but no mouths. Right. And that's very common in Asian cultures to be told things like that. But I think it lends to the experience where you're kind of voiceless, and you can't just be voiceless for 18, 20 years and then suddenly expect to, oh, you're an adult now. Now you have a voice. What are you, you just haven't practiced it. You have not been able to say anything. So it's really funny how, and I respect, all Asian cultures, and I respect my parents and, everybody. But I think that it's funny how there's this switch in our cultures, at least, where it's like you're a child and you don't have any power and you don't have any autonomy. And then the minute you become an adult, you're expected to make very difficult choices for yourself. And one thing that is not translated when people immigrate to the United States, especially from Asian countries, is that, in a lot of Asian countries, we have a collectivist culture, right? We live in generational families. They live in generational households. They all live together, right? And here, I hear from friends and even staff at Mochi who have to move back in with their parents, and they're so ashamed. They're so ashamed because American society makes it seem like it's such a bad thing to rely on your family, to be with your family. But that's all to say that, as individuals, I think that it's harder to have power, right? When you're thinking of yourself as an individual who is trying to strive for all the things that you want and deserve in this society. And I think that that's where, as a publication, we work to remind each other that even if we have unique stories and unique voices and perspectives that are different, that there's a kind of power that comes from coming together as a collective, that comes from, seeing one another as community, seeing one another for our differences, and embracing that, but also, kind of reveling in the things that we find similar in one another. So I think that that's kind of where Mochi Magazine's publication, I think sometimes people will say that we're a soft publication. We don't cover hard news, and we can cover hard news. It's just, I think in the softness, we find collectivity, we find community. And that's something that I think that Asian Americans are missing. I know that that's kind of a broad generalization, but I've heard from a lot of Asian Americans who join our staff, or when I talk about Mochi, that they grew up feeling like they were the only ones, and they may have well been the only Asian American family in their town, right? And I know that there are spaces where Asians of particular ethnicities, gather, like their churches and their groups, but I think that those are very rare. And I think to grow up, personally, for me, to grow up in the San Francisco Bay Area, where there is a majority of Asians, I was very privileged, So I think that it's creating community, creating a sense of not being the only one is really powerful for us.
Yeah, that's amazing. Both of you shared so really beautifully about the power that you are building as a media organization, and then like the impact that that power, the potential, right, impact of that power for the communities that you're serving, the audiences that you're speaking to. There is something really that you both shared out that I just want to lift up about making sure that your audience is being seen as a way for them to both be reflected in what you're sharing, as well as for them to be able to see themselves, right, and then be able to take action or build community, which is really powerful. And wouldn't be if I asked, the New York Times, right, what it is that they're doing, right, they wouldn't be talking about empowering their audiences or representing, right, the best interests of their audiences or building community with their audiences. And so I think that you both spoke really powerfully to the importance of your organizations and also media outlets like yours, right? You also spoke to, wanting there to be more, right, media that is serving these audiences as well, which I think is really notable to lift up as well. My next question, both of you kind of spoke to, and I wanted you to dig in a little bit more about challenging traditional norms, right, about media and like intentionally doing that. And so a little bit of background, I did study mass communications in undergrad. And so this idea around, journalism is objective. It's like, but objective from whose perspective, right? And this idea about being detached from your subjects when you're discussing them or being informative about them, which again is like, who decides what detached and objective is and why, right? Because what connection do you have to the storytelling that you're doing? If you're supposed to be like a blank slate, basically robot, right? Typing out facts and information about something. And so I want to ask you about how important it is to buck against those traditional, media norms, and why that's important for you and for the audiences that you're serving.
I really struggled against objectivity as an English major in college. I remember being like, I don't know how to make arguments regarding these books that, mostly white people wrote without mentioning the fact that I am a person of color. I'm an Asian person. I am a Chinese Filipino woman reading, white male texts, right? So I think it's interesting that subjectivity is like, it feels like a bad word. Like, when you're like, it feels like, oh, like you can't use I in these essays and like you can't use I in reporting. But it's important to know the positionality of the person who is doing the storytelling, who is telling the news, so that you understand, what's at stake for that person when they're telling the news or their story or the stories of other communities. And that, they really like, yeah, I think it's so funny because I've never edited out an I from anything that I've seen come through my way. In fact, sometimes I'll be like, hey, make sure you position yourself in this piece because, you are of this culture or you're not of this culture. And it's important that people know that, where you come from. And I think that that's really, I don't know, I think it just adds value.
So I have a very theological take, but I won't go into very specificities of it. I'll say that like really transformation happens in between the lines when it comes to reporting. Tell you a quick story. I wrote a lovely piece for, of course, it's lovely because I wrote a lovely piece for this really lovely news organization called the Objective Newsroom, right? Media critique organization. Definitely shout out to them. It was on MLK this year, MLK Day. And in the process of writing it, because I hail from, and I've been taught and reared through a structure of writing and speaking that hails from kind of preaching backgrounds or whatnot, I feel like, oh, I should write this piece. And honestly, once I get closer to the end, I'm probably going to start being very personal and saying I. And unfortunately, those things were edited through no qualms with that. But it reminds me of how like people are transformed through the writing because they receive the output, like the information. It's not, you know, our roles are not ones to make a bunch of products. We're actually supposed to steward an experience, right? Because I gave this good analogy to, I was talking to Delia Jones from the Reg space, and I was explaining how it really does matter how you get to your grocery store. So like, for example, my grocery store is, I live in a very white safe haven. So it's across the street. I can like walk with my little tote bag. There's a difference between me putting out some sandals in Houston weather and taking the easy route, which is just crossing the street, versus me going all the way around the block, right? I see more things when I go around the block versus if I just cross the street, I get there, but I wasn't really affected. I didn't get any sort of feel of the neighborhood. I didn't know that, you know, it could be much hotter just standing in the heat much longer than, just getting it real quick and dicey. Shout out to solutions journalism. No, I'm kidding. I was just being a little shady. But the point is like, I think we've seen very often this kind of reduction of information, and people have, capitalists especially, like have thought of it as like, that is a better thing because it's more efficient. And it's very much more watered down, much more crisp, clean mayo, less feeling oriented. And the truth is now we're all walking around saying depression is higher. I mean, that's also because of labor issues and all sorts of other issues. But depression issues, we're not as connected. Folks don't know how to be in community with one another. That's because we've reduced things down and simplified things for so long that they're very rare spaces in which we really are in full emotiveness with each other. Make that word up. But I think subjectivity is very important because that is life, right? Life is subjective. And when we try to take and reduce pieces in our storytelling and our work to something that semblances like a white supremacist norm of like objectivity, we all lose out, including white people, which is so funny to discuss. But that's what comes to mind at the moment.
I think at the risk of being kind of provocative, I will say that, the like you said, like the norm of like objectivity comes from a white supremacist background. And I think it's actually a tool for white supremacy, right? In that it creates stories or, articles and news that is supposedly for a general and mass audience, but we know that it's specifically for a white audience. And when people of color read it, it's meant to align them with whiteness, right? And I'm not saying like white people, because there's a difference between white people and white supremacy, right? But I think that it's meant to align with this notion that, what is happening to our communities is a result of our own doing rather than the systems and the, institutions that are enforcing these things. So I think it's really important that when we take a personal stance, we can see through that. We can see the systems, and you can see how oppression is occurring rather than taking this objective stance.
Even on that note on oppression, I think of this. I tweeted something. I'm very provocative, Giannina. So this is going to be such an interesting matchup because I tweeted out that the same news organizations. So I'm in Houston, very much in conversation with reporters over in Austin. So when the state troopers were at the University of Texas, right, and there's this really viral video that went around with them. One of the cops body slamming a videographer with a huge camera, white older man. I tweeted out, these whenever you see police officers body slamming these journalists, be aware that these are some of the same news organizations that wrote hit pieces or unserious pieces about police defunding, right? Or and much of that was not only because there were folks in the backgrounds kind of moving the strings in news organizations, but also because often one of the myths of objectivity is that we can behave as if we're different, right? We're not the protesters, and we have nothing in common with them, which is so wild and so easy for people who are like more privileged to do. And also underneath that is that we're better than them, right? So sometimes our pieces come off as like paternalistic, as like, this is how you should think of this. I think there was a piece very recently from the Houston Chronicle about how the many folks have been trying to push for a ceasefire resolution at the city level. And I think the headline is something along the lines of, these folks, mind you, they hadn't even written about this for the 7 months that they've been protesting for a while, but they finally did it. And they said, the protesters are trying to get a ceasefire resolution. Here's why they probably won't win, right? Like, this was from our major news organization, right? And a lot of that, I mean, one could say there are Zionists in the background, but also the journalists at the end, they have to make decisions, right? Yeah, people call you up. Yeah, people offer you money, but also, what is it? What are the foundations of your identity that make you more susceptible to saying, yeah, I'm going to go along with that? And I think much of that is thinking that you're different, or thinking that you're better, right? You're not any different. I know I'm not different than the people I report on our news video for Shift Press. I'm not better, right? We in the same tax bracket, same money, same everything. So I think that's one of the things that it's not going to help journalists, especially non-white journalists, to play objectivity, because if we don't call out the fact that we are also at risk by some of these same forces that the people we're reporting on are at risk of, then the death of journalists, the industry, I would dare say, is much more on our doorstep than we actually understand it to be, right? Because we're actually chasing this thing that's killing us. So that's what came to mind, Giannina.
Yeah, I think the like we are different sentiment, like for me, and I might be taking us down a little different topic, but for me, you couldn't see it more than in the like coverage, the news coverage of Asian elders getting attacked, right? Because the way those stories were told, you could tell like they were trying to be quote unquote objective. They were, probably majority white journalists reporting on that, right? Because there's no way an Asian person could have reported on that with just such distance and such like, oh, this is just happening and it's because they like quote unquote it's just hate. It's like, it's not just hate. This is rooted in systemic racism. This is rooted in a legacy and a history of anti-Asian discrimination and prejudice, and to just see these Asian elders, some of which even died from their injuries, get to the point where they were even scared to go out of their houses or even, be in the entryway of their apartments. I think it was just so hard. But then the news was telling it like, and this is happening, and this is happening, and not even providing like a full story, right? They were just providing the most gruesome details, right? Because the ones that they would lift up in the news were stories that, continued the Black versus Asian narrative, right? Where you would see a Black perpetrator on this like fuzzy camera screen attacking this Asian elder. When we know that from statistics that the majority of these attacks occurred, by white people, right? We see like, those white folks doing this to our Asian elders, but that doesn't make the news, so I think the distance from the journalism and the distance that people try to create between who is telling the story and the story itself is actually really harmful for the communities.
Yeah, thank you both so much. You lifted up so many really pressure points, especially around the not just challenging objectivity as a, you know, a supposed standard, right? An aspirational standard, but also the harm that it causes. And also the ways that it's reinforcing systemic discrimination and systemic structures of white supremacy in particular, but not just white supremacy, right? There's this kind of like patriarchal, paternalistic, this is the news institution. I also think that, and this conversation is helping me think about the fact that, not using the word I, right, positions the story as like an authority of an institution and not a writer, reporter, right, who's telling a story, who may have their own biases, their own perspectives, a person who's, likely, especially a corporate, right, institution, a person who's getting paid to, come and cover the story. It erases and flattens all of those things when you say, okay, actually, we don't personalize. And you don't, position yourself as the storyteller, even though you are responsible for telling the story. And then it also abdicates some of the responsibility that you're talking about, Giannina, around seeing the humanity, right? And helping readers, right, see the humanity of what's happening, and also telling the fuller story, like you're saying, Uyoisa, about the context that these stories are happening in. It erases all of those things. And so you both lifted up all of those points really beautifully. And I really appreciate that. And so talking also about what are some reflections, or if you have them, around what do your audiences say about being able to, have an outlet like yours and hear the stories or read the stories that y'all are lifting up and putting out? I want to, shift us into the bright future, right, and the the positive aspects, right, of what you're doing, not just what we're up against, and why it's necessary for us to exist.
They say a lot. One thing, I was covering that same jail. Well, maybe it was another jail one, a previous jail protest, and I because it was particularly related with Palestinians, and there are much more like most normally when these jail support protests come out, it's like quick rapid response. Sometimes they're during the day, sometimes they're in the middle of the night. So often the first people that you see on the scene are much more radical leftist folks, right? So they see a guy with a camera, and all of a sudden I had this guy be like, "What are you doing?" He like gets in the front of the camera. I'm like, "Oh, I'm Uyiosa for Shift Press." He's like, "Oh my goodness, you're from Shift Press. I love that place. Like, y'all do us so right and everything." And so it's really interesting to see that like the people that like we're just I think there are many different ways I can take that, but we're beloved in that way. I think that I'm always concerned that like we have not pushed the bounds enough for people to understand that like you need more than even what we provide, not only from us but from other people who write about you, who talk about you. But I also, one of the things that happens in the editorial process that I'm not necessarily baked all the way in on the writing side, but I get to see very like things from the distance is I see often, this happens more often after, but I love this when it happens during, but afterwards I get a lot of group emails back from the writers to the rest of our staff saying, "Thank you so much for this entire experience. It was amazing." Because one of the things people don't know, things that we don't tell, is we have our editor-in-chief, Amy Fan. But she's very much like a strategy and final look. The actual copy editing and the editing process is handled by a large network of professional journalists across the industry. Some really big names. And we have been really tricky on it if we want to put down a formal list and let people know. But the truth is that all the young writers get that experience, and sort of like sometimes mentorship, because some pieces take longer, of being with some of these folks with from a very big name organizations, the same organizations I bully. There are these individual journalists or editors who are saying, hey, I'll offer my time to you, right? And they say during the I see the Google comments, and they're just thanking some of these folks for allowing them to be a little bit more punchy with what they're wanting to say, because they're used to self-censoring. Even as like current amazing journalists at college newspapers or high school newspapers are like, oh, I've never been able to say it like this. That's so great. So I get that. I get from the external and from the internal process, just a lot of appreciation. And unfortunately, my brain goes like concerned, because it's like, I just wish that we had even more to do, even more for them in a way that gives them even more of the ability to say, hey, these people are doing this. Why aren't you doing this? Right. So I don't know. I know that that's not all the glitz and roses that you wanted, but Giannina, what about you?
I mean, I love to hear from our readers. I know that folks, read our stuff. I think that they don't necessarily email me unless they feel very moved. And when I get those emails, I'm just like, and save, like love this, and forward to everybody who worked on it. Because like you said, like, when somebody writes an article, it's not just the author, right? So like I send it to all the copy editors. I send it to the section editors. I'm like, look, they loved it. Like they said that, they never felt seen before. And we run a lot of personal narratives, right? Like we run lots of very personal stories. So to see that it resonates, like the specificity resonates with people, I think that that's really telling that there's something missing, right? That there's something missing here in not only in journalism, but like in the culture and in our society around, the stories that we share about ourselves and with one another. And it kind of makes me sad that like we don't just have a community where, we feel all the feels and that we can connect in that way. And we feel like we need to go out there and present ourselves in a certain way and wear certain masks. And I absolutely understand, the society we live in is one where we have to wear masks. But, the fact that they aren't even finding community within their own sub-communities makes me kind of sad. But I am very proud that Mochi, provides a space for these really personal narratives, but also narratives like, I remember there's one essay like, to be Asian is to be angry, and I got mixed feedback around that. I think I got, wow, like I do feel angry, and I've never felt validated in that, because I think, again, generationally, we're told not to have strong emotions like that. But at the same time, I also got feedback like, wow, you guys are really political now. It's like, oh, but Asian American is a political identity, So I was like, thank you, thank you, So I think that that's really interesting. And then I think I'll just add another thing is that we're working under this umbrella term Asian American, but we're learning so much about, the subcultures and ethnicities within that umbrella. And one group that I've gotten to know a lot better is the group of transracial adoptees. And many of them are coming of age, and they, are probably older adults, like in their 30s. They're millennials, basically. And you hear these stories about their experiences growing up, and it's very different, right, from one another, but it's also very different from the quote unquote typical Asian American story. And it's just like a kind of story that you haven't heard a lot about. And they have their own nuances, they have their own culture, and you want to be able to respect that, but also welcome them as part of our community, right? So I think that, hearing from transracial adoptees has really changed my perspective on how I go about sharing my Asian American identity and privileges that I have, as an Asian American in my specific identity.
Yeah, both of you raised up points that I want to ask you to reflect on from your own personal perspective. So we've been talking a lot about your organizations and audiences that you're serving. Why did you choose media as a profession? From your personal perspective, and when it comes to, we've talked a lot about how important it is that how ways that young people's voices are erased, right, are silenced. And then, when you become an adult who's supposed to be a decision maker and a leader, you're like, how am I supposed to do that? You haven't been letting me this whole time. So I wanted to ask you about why you chose media and what about your identity formation and development led you to where you are now?
This is easy because I didn't choose media as my profession, and I'm still not sure if it is my profession. So I have a full-time job in policy work, not out of necessity, not necessarily by choice. For folks who hear that and are at my policy work, I love y'all. Y'all know I like y'all. Cool, chill. But the point is that I'm 25, 26 next week. And I come from a really long organizing background. I think a lot of things I don't talk about how deeply important it is, like my background as a first gen Nigerian kid is, and particularly growing up in the geographic place in which I grew up in Houston. But all that to say, I come from a movement background in which I never, starting in around high school or so, maybe end of high school is when I really started to break away from a lot of the ideas of identifying myself to a job. Mm-hmm. Like it was such a nebulous thought. And I had the privilege of neglect from a lot of people. So like in the sense of there weren't people pushing this idea of like, what are you going to be? I know that goes really bad for a lot of people, but for me, it went really well because I was always doing movement work. And that looked in all the places, even places that I really disdain now. So all the places of like the most far left things that I can't repeat ever. And then all the way to like working for the mayor's office, right, at some point. So I've been able to see in all the different ways how less important it is that I necessarily choose a kind of a life path, but be of service to a broader movement and just make sure I'm fed at the end of the day. Like, I know that's really terrible because I do want children, like 16, 20 children or something. I'm kidding. But I think like, when it comes to me coming from an organizing space from a young age and seeing so many problems, and then getting into a situation which I was teaching organizing in a broader kind of thing to younger folks and seeing that they were having some of the same issues I was having that were so uncontrollable. I was like, okay, no, we got to not start building something that gives us some sort of edge, like even a formidable edge. And that one thing that the seven of us back then thought of in 2020 or 2019 has now become deeply important of my life and probably for the rest of my life, whether or not I'm in shift presses kind of space, if that makes sense. Because I have now a sort of rigor when it comes to looking at the world and looking at everything that comes from us having to ask much harder questions than I think most news organizations don't ask themselves about, like stories and impacts and the point of it all, right? Like, so I'm very much fortunate to be in this space, but I'm not sure that also because, I've had big funders, very big institutional funders that everyone knows the names of, say from the very front end of, we love what you're doing, but we don't think you're the team to do it, right? And that was the reason they refused funding. And that was disrespectful, racist, and all the different things, classes, ages, all the things that you can consider. But I also now walking around like I feel good that he was so uncomfortable about us being the people to lead the idea that I proposed to them about Shift Press, because that shows a sort of fissure in what's in the imagination. Now the point is to try to survive while we move through that fissure and make it bigger. So hopefully I answered the question.
I think so.
Happy early birthday, Uyiosa. I also work a job out of necessity other than this job, so I totally know what you're feeling. But, I am here, I think, as editor of Mochi Magazine because of three kind of stories that I can tell. But I tend to be a grandma storyteller. It goes on and on. So I'm just going to try to keep this as short as possible.
You could.
I don't really believe in manifesting things, but it's funny because everybody says when I tell them this, oh, you manifested this for yourself. But I was definitely the child at 5, 6 years old who was cutting out magazine clippings and creating my own magazine just because I wanted it to look a certain way and tell certain stories that I wasn't seeing already, and I was and this is my magazine, and look at me today, right? And this is my magazine, Mochi Mag. And I think that's one tiny reason why I'm in media. Another reason is that I think I was quote unquote stubborn and rebellious as a child. As a teenager, I just had this intrinsic ability to organize people. It's so funny because I remember I was in middle school and I just didn't everybody was complaining about this one teacher. And I was well, then let's organize. What are your demands? What do you not like about this teacher? Let's write it down. Let's make sure that it's clear that, what is going on is not right because this, and this, because otherwise don't complain. What can we do about it? How can we move this forward? And it nearly became a protest at school. Until it was stopped. But it was funny because it got to that point where I could do things like that, even if my parents had never taught me anything like that, because I just intrinsically was so, well, they would call it stubborn, but I was just so strong-willed, So, and then thirdly, I have gone through some very unique experiences in life. I will say that I grew up incredibly privileged, but when I had graduated, or actually, I didn't know at the time when I graduated from college, I was actually pregnant. And I didn't find out I was pregnant until another 6 weeks later. And I ended up deciding to keep the pregnancy and continue forward. I found out, midway through the pregnancy that my child was very likely to have Down syndrome, a disability. I knew, early in the pregnancy that I was going to be doing it alone. I suddenly was thrust into this world where I was filing for Social Security, Medicaid, these things that I had never expected to, have to go through. Not because I'm too good for that, right? But because my parents had immigrated to the United States to give me a better future, not for me to live under the poverty line and, be resorting to these very important social systems. But I just never thought that I would be one of those people. And it was really difficult. And I learned a lot of things about, what it takes to get through those systems and all those just trials and tribulations that so many Americans, particularly people of color, have to go through to get, just basic needs met. So I think for me, having such a unique personal history is why it's really important for me to continue to do this work, right? Because I think that it's interesting how, going from a place of privilege to very disadvantaged to back here where I feel like I have privileges again. I really want to speak up for those who don't have a voice, but also it's not even speaking up for them. It's how do we give them the space for them to speak up and, create their own stories and tell their own stories, because it's really important that everybody knows that the model minority myth doesn't exist, right? It's not a thing, that we can fall from whatever comforts and, things that we have. We're not all crazy rich Asians, like in a flash, like in a blink of an eye. So I think that those are the three things that brought me here, specifically to my role as editor-in-chief of Mochi Magazine, but, probably is what's going to keep me in this space for the rest of my life.
Wow. Thank you both for your unique paths, for being organizers and trailblazers, and creating and carving out space, having to carve out space for yourself as an individual, and then determining that you want to carve out space that also is giving voice to others. I think that's really powerful and a great way for us to let folks know how they can support and contribute to your organizations, and where they can read your incredible work or listen to it.
You can follow Shift Press on Instagram. It's just one word, Shift Press. Head to our website. We have, by the time you hear this, it'll be a spanking new website. So Shift, like the Shift key, .press. Yes, very expensive domain name. And we're also Shift Press on Twitter. Hit us up on LinkedIn. We're doing this thing where we're like making LinkedIn very uncomfortable on purpose by posting all our pieces there too. So do check those out and share those and make your colleagues uncomfortable. But yeah.
I need to try that tactic on LinkedIn as well. You can follow Mochi Mag at Mochi Mag Official. Check out our website at mochimag.com. If the things I've been saying resonates with you and doesn't put you off, because it is provocative, you can join our staff. We're always looking for, new staff. We're also looking for guest contributions. So definitely check that out all on our website. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Giannina, Uyoisa, this has been a great conversation. I know we could talk all day about so many of the things that we brought up in this conversation, and I hope folks who are listening will both share this episode, follow and support your organizations and the work that you're doing, and that it also informs and deepens their perspective. And even though we have, very various perspectives and backgrounds, there's a lot of alignment, right? In the ways that we talked about media, about the structures, right? Shaping media that we're pushing up against, and also the work that it takes to, build institutions that are amplifying the voices that we too often want to ignore, right? Or disregard. And y'all are putting them front and center in your own ways, which is so important. And which is the purpose, right, of the Racial Equity and Journalism Fund, is to support, to give capacity building, give funding, so that you can continue and expand the work that you do, and that you can continue to both not just, grow in the effectiveness of your media institution, but growing the field, right, of media journalism, independent journalism, ethnic media, which is so important as well. Again, my name is Tia Oso. I've been your host of Principal with Zeal. I'm happy to be the producers of the Infinite Patterns, a Kaleidoscope podcast in partnership with the Borealis Philanthropy, Racial Equity, and Journalism Fund. Thank you so much, and continue to enjoy the rest of the series.